In this video, we're going to explore the idea of virtue as knowledge. In the previous video, we defined what virtue was and looked at various ways that it has been defined from past to present. So if you want to go check that out before watching this, I wouldn't blame you. Each definition of virtue had the common element of defining it as the way a virtuous person would behave. So here we will explore what it means when we discuss how a virtuous person would behave. To explore all of the various theories will be a little bit outside of the scope of this video. So instead, we'll focus on Aristotle's account of virtue, as it is a commonly used account of virtue ethics. As stated previously, Aristotle's definition of virtue goes something like, a virtue is a habitual disposition connected with choice, lying in a mean relative to us, a mean which is determined by reason, by which the person of practical wisdom would determine. It is this definition that we will explore and expand upon here. The key term here, of course, is practical wisdom. This gives us some indication of the kind of knowledge that Aristotle has in mind with regard to the virtues. For Aristotle, virtue is a matter of understanding a situation and knowing the appropriate way to respond to that situation. In order to gain a little more clarity about the kind of knowledge that Aristotle is speaking of in this case, we should first look at how Aristotle distinguishes between skills and virtues, or technai and aretai. Consider something like a carpenter or a sculptor. When it comes to judging the technai, or skill, of the carpenter or the sculptor, we find ourselves with an easy way to judge their skill level. One simply has to look at the finished product that the sculptor or the carpenter produces. The finer the product, the finer the skill of the individual that has produced it. We can also look at the way the individual has chosen their materials, the techniques that the individual has chosen when producing the end result, and much, much more. The same cannot be said for the virtuous agent, though. We cannot simply see the end result of the action taken by the agent in some situation. Consider a situation where person A gives continual verbal support to person B, which makes person B happy. From the outcome, we might think that person A was behaving in a virtuous way. After all, kindness is a virtue. Encouraging someone could be considered an act of kindness. What, though, if we introduce the idea that person A was only giving that verbal support because they believed that person C might see them in a better light, or that person B might give them some kind of financial reward? Would we still consider person A to be acting in a kind or virtuous manner? The answer here would probably be no, as person A was not acting kindly, they were acting with ulterior motives. The motives for their action was the hope of some future reward. This means that we cannot determine if an agent is behaving in a virtuous manner simply by looking at the results of their actions. An illusion of kindness can look like a genuine act of kindness. What makes it an act of genuine kindness is the motivations of the agent, meaning that we must know the reasons why an agent is acting as they are in order to understand whether the agent has acted virtuously, or has acted in a way that gives the illusion of virtue. So while technai can be assessed by their products, aretai must be assessed in a more complex manner. An argument made by Hughes is to consider for a moment the idea of someone that we might refer to as bad-tempered or good-natured. If an individual lost their temper very rarely, we would not refer to them as bad-tempered. The same can be said of the one we call good-natured. If someone showed kindness only on occasion, then we would not call them a kind person. We might refer to some of their actions as kind, but we would not refer to them as generally kind. It is only when someone has the habit of losing their temper easily that we refer to them as bad-tempered. It is only when someone is kind out of habit that we refer to them as a kind person. The same could be said of the virtuous agent. It is not when someone occasionally performs an act that we would consider virtuous that we call them a virtuous agent. It is when they behave habitually in a virtuous way that we consider them a virtuous agent. This means that it could be argued that virtues are habit, as described by Aristotle when he says that virtue is a habitual disposition. This means that in Aristotle's account of the virtues, the virtuous agent is one who responds in a habitually virtuous way to the situations that they find themselves in. As stated previously, the virtuous agent is one who understands what a particular situation requires and responds appropriately. What is it to respond appropriately according to Aristotle's account, though? In order to get a better grasp of this, we must first understand how Aristotle sees the virtues as being connected to our emotions. When it comes to our emotional responses to particular situations, we cannot control the emotional reaction. We feel angry or afraid, regardless of our choosing to. However, what we can choose is how we respond to those feelings. Moral virtue, according to Aristotle, is about feelings and actions. It is a habit related to choice, and choice is deliberated desire. Here we see Aristotle arguing that moral virtue is related to how we choose to respond to our feelings and desires. It is responding to situations with the appropriate or inappropriate feelings. Linguistically speaking, we often find the virtue surrounded by vices. For example, we find bravery surrounded by cowardice and foolhardiness. Cowardice and foolhardiness are extremes at either end of the spectrum, while bravery is to be found somewhere in the middle. The circumstances of the situation will give us some indication of which of the three descriptors is apt for the agent's reaction in the circumstance, of course, and we'll mention more of this shortly. For now, it is enough to understand that there is a kind of middle ground between the two extremes. This middle ground is what Aristotle refers to as lying in the mean. One could be forgiven for thinking that this means that Aristotle is arguing that virtuous responses are ones that are always moderate, and that the virtuous agent is one who has a disposition to always respond in a moderate way. However, it would be a mistake to think this is what is being argued. As stated previously, it is not about moderate responses, but about appropriate responses. There may be times where the appropriate response to the situation is one that is very low-key or one that is very intense. The response will be dictated by the situation, as well as how the agent has assessed the situation. It is reason that determines what the appropriate response is, and it is reason that determines what underreacting and overreacting would be in the particular situation. There is no particular rule that can be given to determine the appropriate response to each particular situation. We may be able to give some generalizations, and these generalizations may even hold in many cases. However, these generalizations are about the best we can do. Aristotle argues that hitting the mean is difficult. He does his best to distinguish between formulating rules and using our reason as a means of perceiving the appropriate response to a situation. Every statement about conduct has to be an outline, not a detail. The types of statements we make should reflect the nature of the subject. There is nothing fixed about conduct or about what would be helpful for us, not any more than there is about health. This applies to our general statements, and particulars are even less exact. They do not fall under any art or percept. In all cases, the people concerned are who need to see what the situation demands, just as in medicine or navigation. It is here that we find Aristotle's standard for determining what our appropriate responses are, and for determining which habitual dispositions are virtues. That standard is practical wisdom. The appropriate response is one that is in accord with the judgment that someone with practical wisdom would make. To possess practical wisdom is to possess the ability to think well about what we should do. In this case, it is to be able to think well about eudaimonia, about living a worthwhile and fulfilled life as a whole. Practical wisdom, then, is a kind of intellectual skill. As argued by Hughes, we can see this in Aristotle's ideas that having a balanced sensitivity is an important element in moral decision-making. However, having a balanced sensitivity is not enough in and of itself. Moral decisions involve choices, and choices made for reasons. Choice and reason both exercise our intellect. Just as we can train our emotional responses, we can train our intellect to make good moral decisions. We can improve our assessments of situations and improve our assessments of how we should respond to those situations. The training of our intellect to make good moral decisions and improving our assessments and responses is a part of practical wisdom. Aristotle gives us two intellectual virtues that we can come to possess as thinking beings, and these two intellectual virtues are determined by the subject matter. The first deals with thinking about scientific subjects and is referred to as Sophia. The second, named phronesis, is what we are concerned with. Phronesis is being good at thinking about practical matters and is related to practical wisdom. One who has phronesis is one who has good moral judgment. Aristotle distinguishes practical skills from practical wisdom, though practical wisdom involves a kind of know-how. An argument given by Hughes is that we should consider something like the skill of a physician here, where health is the product of the art of the medicine. The physician aims at producing healthy patients, and to do so, the physician must know what being healthy involves. The physician must also learn what medicines to prescribe, how they must be administered, and in what quantity, with just the right amount being given, neither too much nor too little. So here the physician needs both practical wisdom in understanding the kinds of health problems the patient may present, and practical skill in knowing the amounts of medicine needed for the health problems. The product that is aimed at is health, and how good the physician is at helping people get healthy gives us some indication of the physician's practical wisdom and practical skill. However, eudaimonia, living a fulfilled life, is not the product of the actions of a good person. A fulfilled life is not the end result of the good person's action. Eudaimonia is found in the actions themselves, and found in the person seeing those actions as noble and worthwhile. Being able to live a fulfilled life is being good at living a fulfilled life. We do not live a fulfilled life for the sake of something else. The point of living a fulfilled life is just the living of it. So as with the example of the physician, we can look at living the fulfilled life in a similar way. A person aims at producing a fulfilled life. In order to produce a fulfilled life, the person must know what fulfillment involves. The person must learn what actions produce fulfillment, with these actions being virtuous and lying in the mean. In other words, eudaimonia exists in making sense of the morally admirable life. The important part here, of course, is the idea that practical wisdom has to do with the human good itself. This distinguishes it from other practical skills. While other practical skills are concerned with creating a good product, practical wisdom is concerned with good actions. Actions where the good is intrinsic to the actions themselves. It is not enough to have an appropriate emotional response. It is necessary but not sufficient in order to be considered a virtuous response. The person needs practical wisdom, which involves understanding why it is an appropriate response. The action is not considered virtuous because it is effective. It is considered virtuous because of how it is perceived by the agent. So far, we have seen the following. The virtues involve knowing what it means to live a fulfilled life. Knowing that living a fulfilled life involves living a virtuous life. Understanding that living a virtuous life involves responding to to particular situations with virtue. Understanding that virtue involves responding to particular situations with an appropriate response. Knowing what the appropriate response is and understanding that it lies somewhere within the mean between the vices. All of these things gives us some indication that there is a certain kind of knowledge involved in the virtues, with that knowledge being practical wisdom. However, this is still too simplistic of an account of virtue. There is more that needs to be considered here when it comes to responding appropriately to a situation. We need to examine what it means to respond appropriately in a more detailed way. In order to do this, we'll look at the virtue of kindness. This is because in the account of the virtue of kindness, we can find what might be considered a difficult appropriate response. We can also see why it is difficult to give general rules of guidance that are appropriate to every situation, and why virtue lies in the particulars, and why it lies in the perception of a particular situation. We would generally consider being kind to be a virtuous action. As McDowell states, there is little that we would find controversial in claiming that kindness is a virtue. However, consider the idea of encouraging someone to achieve their goals. We would consider it kind to encourage someone to achieve their dreams, to pursue their goals, or to try new things. It could be considered a vice to go out of our way to discourage someone, with most people considering it mean to discourage someone. Encouragement can mean the difference between someone putting in the effort to learn the skills needed and giving up before they have given themselves a chance to gain those skills. In the case of someone attempting some new project or attempting to learn some new skill, it may be appropriate to say well done to some attempt. If the product they have created shows some merit, it is a kindness to tell them they have made a good attempt. It is also a kindness to give some constructive criticism, as constructive criticism can be considered a form of encouragement. We are, in essence, helping them to achieve the goal they desire to reach. If we are overcritical or discouraging when they have done a reasonable job, then we are seen as being too harsh and not behaving with virtue. We must know what the situation requires. However, what about if the person, even after much practice, shows no skill whatsoever? Or what of a situation where the person has produced some piece of work that they think is brilliant and will make them a fortune from selling it? In this situation, the appropriate response might be different. It may be kinder to tell them honestly that they are not cut out for the type of activity they are trying to achieve. For example, it may be kinder to tell a person interested in taking up boxing, but who has a glass jaw, that boxing is not the activity for them. If someone is about to invest their life savings into a project that will fail before it gets off the ground, then it may be kinder to warn them that their endeavor may not be the best choices. In these cases, honesty may be the virtue that is the appropriate response. This gives us some indication of the complicated nature of the virtues. It may not be enough to understand a single virtue, or even a few virtues, in order to be able to respond appropriately. The virtuous person must be in possession of knowledge of all the virtues, and understand how they relate to each other, and how they relate to a particular situation. In other words, a virtuous person must know which virtue applies to which situation, which comes from a combination of understanding and experience. If practical wisdom involves a combination of understanding and experience, and involves the ability to read individual situations right, and drawing on that understanding and previous experience, then virtue can only be considered a form of practical wisdom. As can be seen here, virtue is a complicated matter. Responding to a situation in a virtuous manner involves more than simply giving what looks to be the right response. We must understand that it is the right response and why it is the right response. In order to do that, we must have an understanding of virtue itself and why responding with virtue is right. There must be some understanding of why we would want to live a virtuous life and how it relates to living a fulfilled life. As stated previously, it is not just having people skills and being a people pleaser. It is not something that can be seen by its end product. Virtue is, as Aristotle states, an intellectual skill, one that involves a particular kind of knowledge, with that particular kind of knowledge being practical wisdom. However, is that enough to consider it knowledge in and of itself? In the next part, we will look at the arguments for why virtue is not knowledge, before assessing both sides of the argument and attempting to come to some kind of conclusion.